Okay, we need to get started. Welcome. Debunking 7 persistent learning myths. Actually, I'm very excited about this. I'm sure I believe several of these myths, so this should be good. Today we have Assad and Fakir from Edly, a fantastic open edX partner. And I'll let you guys take it away. I'll be managing the microphone, and if you have questions and all that, I'll pass it to you. All right.
Can you also get the other microphone for now? And for Q&A.
There's only one. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And welcome. Thank you for coming and listening to us. My name is Assad Iqbal. I lead the Learning and Instructional Design Division at Edly. My background is in cognitive science and learning design. And my colleague Bilal.
Yeah, I'm Fakir Bilal from Edly as well. My background is in education technology and product management. I'm also a core contributor for OpenEdX.
Awesome. And yeah, before we get started, I just wanted to say that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this session have to do with myths, obviously. We'll be talking about some approaches, some frameworks, some strategies, some techniques, some research. We'll also be taking some names. Our intention in this session is not to, in simpler words, not to say anything bad about anyone or their research. It's simply to present findings from an empirical, a standpoint, and just to, discuss as colleagues and as practitioners, as this Open edX community, to think about what we can do to advance, our collective learning in terms of learning and education, and how we can emphasize on evidence and research, so that whatever we create, whether it be a MOOC or a course, a facilitator-led training, or any other type of learning product, so that it is founded and grounded in empirical evidence. So I just wanted to start with that. All right. So in terms of what you can expect to take away from today's session, well, obviously the importance of debunking and dispelling the myths. I think everybody is in the room because they recognize that. We'll also be discussing some of the origins and why these myths persist, right? As well as what cost they have on education and learning and development as a field. And a deeper understanding, which we can't guarantee and promise because it's only 45 minutes, but at least, actually this is probably a myth. Probably not a deeper understanding, but at least some level of surface understanding on what some of these common myths are. Some insights on some evidence-based practices to design effective learning experiences. Again, we won't be diving too much into instructional design or curriculum design or any of those areas, but we'll touch upon those. And lastly, in my opinion, probably the most important one being the tools that we can use to self-critique, ask questions, introspect, really just think about what we have got right and where there is an area of improvement, so that we can continue to ask these questions and improve. Okay, so first, I want to talk about where these myths come from, because it's very unlikely that in any field, the myths or there's a term called neuromyths or learning myths, whatever we want to call them. They come from within the community, and that's a cause of concern. But also an opportunity for us to recognize how we can go forward, how we can ask those questions. So the first source, if you will, is the misinterpretation of research. People conduct research. The research itself is sound. It's it's great research, but the findings from the research aren't always correctly understood, which leads to widespread misinformation and disinformation related to it. So this seems to be the highest ranking source. The second one is just transferability, the question of whether a research that was conducted in a particular context can lead to universal findings or can be transferred or applied to contexts that are remote or very distinct from the original context, right? So ignoring specific conditions of applicability leads to questions of validity or reliability or authenticity of that research. So any of you that work in academia or research in varied capacities already know about the importance of those. The third one is favoring action research alone over theoretical underpinnings, right? So we're not saying that action research is bad, action research is amazing. My practice involves a very heavy focus on action research, so literally going to the classrooms, talking to teachers, talking to students, talking to designers, sitting down with them, spending hours upon hours, understanding what the issues are. But the theoretical underpinnings are an equally important part. So if you ignore one over the other, it leads to some of the things that we're going to look at. Quick and easy solutions. We all, want things that are quick and easy and effective, but the thing is that it's just not always easy, right? So teachers want faster results because there are questions of performance and achievement and how your students do, how they, and if you're an instructional designer or a professor, whatever, you want the best outcomes for yourself, for your students, for the organization that you work at, a university, school, whatever, right? So that's one of the sources as well. And then finally, just bad science, really. Not a lot of research that gets published has gone through, if you will, the highest and the rigorous standards that we have in the L&D field or just generally in education. Now, the ones that I'm referring to are usually, not always, coming from the corporate sector, so white papers with just claims which are unverified, right? Something that worked is, in a given context is presented as evidence or research that is empirical. So that's the fifth one that we wanted to make note. And obviously, poor quality studies are becoming increasingly popular. You don't have to go too far. Go to Scopus Index, whatever research index that you use, and just take a look at how many research papers and articles are published by a single author within a single year, right? The number has gone significantly up thanks to a lot of advancements in technology, the ability for cross-functional and cross-area research, but at the same time, it comes with a cost, right? So anyway, I've taken a lot of time to talk about that. The previous slide, we talked about the origin, right? But why do these myths persist is the key question. And that's why we use the term in the title, 7 persistent learning myths. If we know that there is bad research, and if there are good educators and researchers out there who are able to point those things out, why is it that they persist? Well, the first reason, at least in our preview, in our research, is that they sound plausible in most cases. They are often advocated by qualified and credible education professionals. I should have done air quotes when I said that. The idea there is that because they're plausible and they look right, they sound right, people have a tendency to say they must be right? And just want to adopt those. The second one is the lack of nuance in interpreting and applying learning theories to practical instructional contexts. I have 2 master's degrees. I'm doing a PhD in education. I surround myself with research all the time, asking questions, but not everybody has that luxury or that privilege. People are working and doing great things, right, in practical settings. All of you in the room are doing those things, but maybe it's possible that the lack of nuance comes from people who publish research. It's also possible that the lack of nuance comes from the consumers of that research, right? So I feel like there's just something that needs to be done to bridge the gap between research and practice so that everybody's on the same page about what the research says about certain things. So that, and then the third one being the simultaneous reflex. Is anyone aware or would like to volunteer in the room and tell us about, if you know what that is, what that reflex is about? No one? Okay, no problem. So it's actually basically a reflex-like tendency to reject evidence that contradicts with something that you already believe. And all of us have that. As humans, we're naturally wired in a way that if some evidence aligns with what you already believe, you're more likely to accept that. And if the evidence rejects what you already believe, you're like, maybe there's another reason for it. It's attributed to something else. You're not readily willing to accept that. That's also a key reason why these myths persist. So why did we talk about that? Because as we go through this section, I just wanted to encourage all of you to question assumptions and do a healthy level of self-critique. Have you ever, experienced or used any of these ideas in your practice? Again, I don't know how many developers in the room, how many people who work with platforms, how many people who work with actually designing courses. So maybe to suit that question to your own context, and I just encourage everybody to do that. And also embrace new evidence to improve educational practices is something that we should all be doing. So kind of like that unlearning, relearning to make sure that we're going in the right direction. Okay. With that, it's 7 myths that we'll be talking about, so I'm just going to cut right down to those. We'll be presenting, like this screen is very, like it's going to come up multiple times. And essentially what you'll see is 2 options on the screen, and we would love to hear from you about which one of those is the myth, where myth is the approach towards learning or a design practice that lacks scientific evidence. I think, there we go. Okay, so Patricia is a dedicated teacher. She carefully plans her lessons and goes the extra mile to ensure that all her lessons are tailored and customized to the distinct learning styles of all her students. B is Patricia is a dedicated teacher. She carefully plans her lessons and focuses on using varied instructional strategies to engage all students. I think this one should be very easy. Which one do y'all think is the myth? A. And does anybody want to say why? Yeah, because I think the easier part is the recognizing which one, but if we just want to take maybe 1 minute thinking about why, or, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just saying that it's about the learning styles, usage. Yeah, gratefully, when I was doing my PhD as well, I had the contact with a professor of psychology, and I wanted to do my research on learning styles. And he immediately said, that's not the way to go. And he talked about learning approaches, which is kind of different. And from that point onwards, every time I hear a teacher or somebody talking about learning styles, then I step a little bit back to see what it comes from there.
Awesome, great. Thank you for sharing that. And I think many of us have experienced something similar where you're like, hold on a minute, not too sure about that. So thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Pedro. Sorry? Pedro. Okay, Pedro. Thank you for sharing that, because I think the term learning styles has become kind of like a, just that people they hear the term and they're like, yeah, no, I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those. It's almost like a, yeah. So I can relate with love. Anybody else that wants to share why A seems to be the myth? Yeah, go ahead. I think got the mic. Sorry, we're gonna have to share the mic because there's 2 of them. So
yeah, thank you. So I think it may be practically impossible to create learning plans for all the students and tailoring it for all the students, because there could be a lot of diversity when it comes to students. So it could be practically impossible is what I'm thinking. That's why it's the myth.
Well, I would say that's a logistical constraint, but you're absolutely right on. I think it does pose a big logistical constraint, and that's why the teaching profession is becoming so difficult. Teachers are leaving. If you're on, if you're on LinkedIn or any other platform, you look at teachers that have worked in the classroom in the United States, it's a big thing. People are just getting into instructional design because, it's becoming increasingly impossible, right? The pressure that they have from district school boards and from even in higher education, actually, and other sectors is just frankly insane, right? It's not feasible. It's not sustainable. You're absolutely right, Tahir. Anybody else? I think if not, I'll move on to. No, sorry. Did you still want to add or no? Okay. Okay, perfect. So yes, learning styles. Essentially, I know many in the room are already familiar, but it's the belief that each student has a distinct learning style. You know, that whether that is visual or auditory or kinesthetic or I don't know, spatial, this and that. And there's like 7. There used to be 7 categories. Right now, according to the Institute of Research and Learning Styles, there are as many as 17. So imagine having to tailor your instruction to 17 different kinds of learners in every world. It's just not possible. So the belief that your learning practices and teaching practices, assessment practices, and curriculum design must be catered to those styles, that's the myth. And it likely originated from Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, which, by the way, when I did my master's in education, was a core component of our curriculum. And it's not so much Gardner's research that was wrong about multiple intelligences, it's the interpretation of the research. So it is true that people have a tendency and they have a component within their brain, where the multiple intelligences exist, right? But there's no evidence that catering to the distinct learning styles will result in better outcomes, right? So children or adults, so whether we're talking in the domain of pedagogy or andragogy or even hoitagogy, which is about self-directed learning, this myth holds good in all 3 of the settings, right? The popular appeal is that the idea seems intuitive and it respects individual differences. So when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, it just seems to work. It's like, yeah, I'm being inclusive in my as an instructional designer if I'm catering to all the different kinds of learners. But implications. So that's I think Tahir alluded to it, right? Wasted resources, misguided instructional strategies, ineffective lesson plans, and the list goes on and on and on. The challenge is that teachers also end up spending a lot of time on strategies that simply don't enhance learning, right? So there's also a resistance to change. Now, what do we do with this information? If we all understand that the myth exists and we understand that it's causing a problem, it has an impact, well, the first thing is to recognize that the research shows no significant benefit. The second is, instead of adapting to the learning styles, use varied multiple instructional strategies strategically so that you're engaging all students across all the cognitive functional domains. Trust me, every learner has a need to be taught across all of the cognitive functional domains. Doesn't matter if you have an athlete, doesn't matter if you have a student in a remote part of the world that's facing technology barriers, doesn't matter if your student is an Ivy League graduate, that idea of engaging all cognitive domains still holds good. So adapting your teaching to the content and context and not assuming learning styles is the key, right? So focus on that. I'll go on to the next one. I don't think we're doing very good on time because what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to just take a minute to read quickly and let us know what the styles are. We'll talk about the reasons later, but I think the recognition pit is still important. So anyone? And if there's a preference, I'm happy to read it out loud. I just don't want to, I don't know if this works better. A again. Okay, I think I heard many people saying, right. So the 70-20-10 model. What is the 70-20-10 model? Essentially, it's it's about the idea that 70% of learning is experiential through hands-on learning and contextualized learning. 20% is social through peer-to-peer collaboration, and those means, and only 10% is formal learning that you see in the form of courses and training. So the idea that you have to really go outside of that formal instructional setting to reap the benefits, it is unfortunately a myth. There's no denying the fact that experiential learning is extremely helpful. I think everybody can and should recognize that. But the 70-20-10, well, first and foremost, research does not look like that. You don't see 10, 20, 30% real data, and research is messy. Okay, you get numbers that just don't always add up, right? So models that are overly simplistic and reductionist should be a giveaway in itself. But the other related myth is about the Dale's cone of experience, which some of you already might know, which was originally presented by Edgar Dale to just show as an analogy back in the 60s. That there's a learning progression from concrete to abstract. That was the original intent. So the misinterpretation of it is that people do learn X% through Y, or whatever, and so on and so forth, right? So that's essentially what the myth is. So what do we do with that information? You see, the challenge is that instructional designers and practitioners often take those numbers as prescriptive rather than descriptive. And that leads to rigid applications. I have spoken to many instructional designers who say that at least X% of the course that I'm designing must include discussion forums, and this percent must include this activity where I'm putting this together through a drag and drop activity, and that's just poor instructional design. Right? They will say that like designing your courses based on those numbers and using them in a prescriptive way is a problem. That's the challenge. These are heuristics, and they're not scientifically validated formulas. So if you really must use them, please remember that they're not prescriptive. They are designed to help you visualize, right, those things. So that's that. And the final one is that applying this model, both of these models actually, can ignore the complexities of different learning contexts. So what do we do? Evidence tells us that effective learning requires flexible and context-specific approach. So blend various instructional methods based on the learning outcomes. And focus on conceptual procedural flow, which again, I don't want to spend time talking about what conceptual procedural flow is in detail, but just very quickly, if the goal is to teach your students something that is more conceptual in nature about the what, you will align with explanations of what the concept is. And if the goal is to teach them something more procedural in nature, you will blend that with that. So essentially, the concept of conceptual procedural is related to that, right? So sometimes there may be a heavier focus on the procedural component. If you're teaching somebody how to install Windows or how to do something, then essentially you'll be able to see intuitively that there's a heavier focus on the procedural side and maybe less so on the conceptual side. So that, as designers, as teachers, we just have to use those. And then also focus on near versus far transfer of learning. So whatever you're teaching, if you're designing a course on customer service or customer satisfaction, and you tell people about rules and principles of service design and things like that, it's going to be likely that they're only going to understand what those concepts are and may not be able to apply that learning when they're actually dealing with those situations. So, okay, I think I'm going to pass it on to Bilal on this one. Also, again, I don't think we're doing very well on time.
I think you're doing it this one as well.
Oh, really? Okay, sorry, my bad. So the third one is about Sarah designs her lessons to manage cognitive load effectively, ensuring her students can stay engaged and retain information. The second one is Sarah recognizes that her students, especially younger ones, are affected by reduced attention spans due to digital media, so she designs her lessons to be very short and fast-paced. Think YouTube Shorts and Snap Stories and all of that, and let me know what you think. B is the myth, okay. We all agree on this side as well? Okay, why do we think B is the myth? It's longer, so probably the myth, but any thoughts, ideas? Yes, please.
Yeah, the idea that just making something short and fast-paced would actually solve the issue seems to be the myth, in my opinion. Like, the reduced attention span is a separate question.
Right.
But saying, let's make it short and fast-paced instead of
Right.
make sure that we still design something that is engaging and
Yeah.
people retain information.
Excellent. So even if reduced attention spans is true, so even if the notion that younger generations have that, even then it would be a problem, because assuming that if you make it short and fast, it's still going to be effective. I love that, because there's essentially two components to it, right? So the notion that people do have reduced attention spans, and the notion that making something to be short and quick is going to lead to better outcomes. And we're going to talk about that, microlearning, and all of the concepts that we've heard about and we've utilized, right? So firstly, the belief that younger generations have shorter attention spans, there's no proof. Contrary to what you see and read, again, anyone in the room who has that expertise more than I do or more than we do may be able to add more of that nuance, but the research is very clear on that. There is no evidence at a neuroscientific level or at a behavioral level that suggests that there's a declining attention span. What is happening is that the way people engage with their surroundings and social media, that's evolving, right? But that has nothing to do with your ability to focus on something for a longer or a shorter period of time or that, right? So Mark Pensky coined the term digital natives in 2001, also referring to the idea that younger people who grew up in the technology age are just better at using technology because they grew up. And the thing is, it happened to be incidentally true, obviously. My nephew is way better than I am at installing games and troubleshooting things than my dad is, for example. But that has nothing to do with the fact that that growing up as a digital native, and that idea and that notion of digital native versus digital immigrant, which, by the way, I'm a millennial. I would still be a digital immigrant because I didn't. I grew up back when we had to connect Ethernet and we didn't have Wi-Fi. But so that's the first point. Now, correlation between digital media use and attention span is often overstated, which is another reason why that misrepresentation exists. So what do we do about that? Firstly, as designers, as practitioners, as teachers, instructors, we need to focus on the cognitive load and the task relevance, right? Which is crucial for maintaining attention and learning. Some of the tasks do require longer explanations, and there's no workaround. They will require a longer explanation. We just have to chunk it, we have to break it down, and some tasks do not require longer explanation and description. So inherently, we have to think about the cognitive load that is attached to the task at hand and the outcome that we're looking to achieve, not with the duration. And also, by the way, the notion that microlearning is about shorter courses is a myth. The word micro in microlearning is not micro in size. It's about micro in scope. How much focus should be on the outcomes. You could have a 30-minute long course and that could still very well be microlearning. And you could have a 15-minute course that talks about 7 learning outcomes and intends to achieve them and not be microlearning. So micro, it does not mean micro in size. And it's surprising how many people, unfortunately, seem to not get that the right way. So some of the references that are important frameworks are constructive alignment. If anybody is familiar with it, please do look that up. Think about how you can use all of the practices to align that. And then also, microlearning, where you talked about that. Okay. Also, cognitive load theory that was proposed by John Sweller is an excellent resource that we should all read about. It's one of those, old is gold, proposed way back, but still very, very relevant today. Also, the information processing model, how the human brain receives information, perceives it, retains it, stores it, retrieves it, and then reproduces it is really, really, really important. And there are logistical constraints with the way our brain processes information, but that has nothing to do with declining attention span. So that's kind of like the key takeaway. Okay, over to you, Bilal, with the next one. Yeah.
Awesome. So 3 down, 4 minutes to go. Let's put on our Mythbuster caps on once again. Fatma develops educational activities that engage her students in a variety of tasks, utilizing their full cognitive potential. Statement B, Fatma develops educational activities that cater to her students' dominant brain hemisphere, creating separate exercises for left brain and right brain learners to provide more targeted learning support. So yeah, B. And can you call out which part of this is suspicious to you? The dominant brain. What else? Left brain and right brain. Sorry, what's that? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Exactly. So providing targeted learning support as well. So this myth and also the 10% brain utilization, they're all like grouped into a single myth for the purpose of the presentation. They're all related to neurology and brain, so that's why we're going to address them together. So the 10% brain utilization is also related to left person and right brain. It's a very old myth, and it got popularized by Lucy. So for example, even it's easy to trust this myth, by the way, if you're hearing it in the authoritative voice of Morgan Freeman, but it's still bad science. So the belief are that people are either left brain, so they're analytical, logical, they have better attention to detail, or they're right brain, they're artistic, and they're creative. Or the other myth, which is that people use a certain portion of their brain. And so a lot of this psychology and neuroscience is related to the work done in 1960 by Robert Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga. And the idea was that they conducted research on patients where, as a treatment for epilepsy, their hemispheres were severed. And so that was the context of that research where, again, they conducted researches to find out which part of the brain would do different tasks. And they observed the differences in people where the left hemisphere had been severed versus the right side of the brain. I do want to call out that this work in and of itself isn't the myth. It's the interpretation of this work. So this work was very valuable. Robert Springer got a Nobel Prize for his work, and there's a lot of our understanding that we have today and a lot of useful ideas that we have about how hemisphere works is owed to the work that was done by both of these scientists. But the myth part where you have a certain brain, part of the brain that does something else and another part that does something else, that's not true. We're not left or right brain, we're all whole brain, and that's how we learn. Most recently, in 2013, there were fMRI activities done to identify which portions of the brain are involved with different aspects of learning. So that showed more, let's say it like we were able to conceptualize it a little bit better about how learning works. And again, this idea was found to be not quite accurate. So what are the implications of this? One of the main ones is that this myth is still one of the more harmful ones, even though we've known for multiple decades that this is like a persistent and prevalent myth. And a lot of educators are using these ideas in their classroom to try to unlock that extra brain power to get their students to achieve more, improve learning outcomes. It also forces you to tailor your learning to different brain learning styles. And again, a lot of that is just mythology, basically. The issue with doing it like this is that obviously you have wasted resource, but it's also based on incomplete or oversimplified understanding of how our brain works. There are a lot of consequences, obviously, in addition to wasted time and resources for educators. It can also lead to subpar or suboptimal outcomes, for education and for students. So, like we talked about, and we'll share citations for the researchers that we're referencing here. Both hemispheres are involved with learning. They do, different things, but you need both sides of your brain to learn things. So even if you're more analytical, you will be using the left side of your brain as well. So let's do the next one. Umer uses learning analytics to measure the success of his training sessions and courses by the high engagement interaction levels and learner satisfaction, as these are reliable indicators for effective learning. The other statement is that Umer measures the success of his training sessions by assessing multiple indicators of learning, including retention and application of knowledge. Hey, is there any difference of opinion? Cool. So, can you call out what's dubious about A?
Reliable indicators for effective learning.
Great. Reliable indicators of learning. Anything else?
Engagement and satisfaction.
Yeah, engagement and satisfaction levels. So again, this one is pretty relevant myth as well for this conference. So a lot of times what we're optimizing for is engagement and interaction. And what we assume when we do those things is that if we can measure those things, because they're more convenient to measure, that we are thereby, by extension, also measuring transfer of learning, when in fact that is not the case. So what's the exact belief? Look at that. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. So the belief is that engagement, interaction, motivation, and these other proxy indicators are reliable way to measure transfer of learning or effectiveness of learning. And the origin obviously is that because a lot of LMS tools that we use to deliver learning provide these metrics as well, and they have a place, of course. They're reliable metrics to measure other things, but perhaps not the transfer of learning itself. And again, they stem from oversimplified understanding of neurosciences and educational psychology. So the implication is that a lot of educators, teachers, especially people that are delivering learning online, they're able to get these metrics readily. And if you're getting good high scores, for example, you're assuming that the transfer of learning is happening more effectively. And so, for example, of course, as you can see that that's a bad way to do it. For example, you wouldn't. So you can measure if the food at this conference is good, but you won't use that as a way to determine if the conference was a great one. And so there are a lot of things that people do to try to measure learning. So for example, one is that if we've presented this information that it's been acquired, another one is that if there's more interaction, that more learning happen. Again, another proxy that fails to properly measure learning. More engagement, again, is not necessarily equal to more learning. And a lot of product discussions that we've had at this conference are designed to optimize engagement, which again, in and of itself is not a bad thing. But that's, again, not going to help us measure transfer of learning. And we already talked about high scores. So a lot of these things that we just talked about, they have very limited reliability when it comes to measuring learning. So what do? We need to have a more holistic approach when it comes to measuring learning. We want to use more reliable, authentic, and evidence-informed strategies, both in classrooms as well as when we're optimizing our platforms and our technology, including when we're having product discussions about the product. So, the myth. Mike incorporates game elements into his courses, ensuring they are integrated with educational goals to enhance learning. Mike incorporates interactive and engaging game elements into his courses, as gamification usually leads to better learning outcomes. B. And again, can you share what's suspicious about B? Yeah, better learning outcomes. So again, a lot of people in this space, so obviously a lot of us are working in ed tech, we're guilty of doing this. A lot of companies that we work with are guilty of this, where they build certain functionality around gamification, and they basically paint it as like the solution to just fixing all learning problems. And I think it's safe to assume that that's not quite how that works. The belief is that if we can do gamification for anything, we should do that, and that thereby we can improve learning outcomes and improve. And we can measure that by improved learning engagement. But just like we talked about, learning engagement and interaction in and of itself aren't good proxies for learning. And again, the origin is a lot of businesses and organizations are using all of these ideas to enhance their platforms. And then there's a bias to use features that are available to you, but that's not going to necessarily transfer to transfer of learning. Finally, okay, so I'm going to speed up a little bit, but the idea is that when it comes to gamification, if you can improve interaction and if you can improve engagement, which happens most of the times with gamification, that's good. But it's only effective if you can also improve transfer of learning. So that's the third one to watch out for. So with gamification, as other things, they need to be well-intentioned, and they need to be aligned with learning outcomes. So any intervention or any strategy or enhancement that you're going to use from a technological perspective or a pedagogical perspective needs to serve a purpose, and gamification in and of itself is not that. It can even sometimes be a distraction. For a certain product, gamification could be the wrong thing, and you thereby hamper the learning effectiveness of your learning products. Here's the last myth. So Letabo designs her curriculum tailored to her students' preferences and interests, ensuring that a learner-centered approach is the best way to enhance learning. B, Letabo designs her curriculum based on what her students need to achieve their educational goals, ensuring a purposeful and comprehensive learning experience.
I think I'm hearing A. Okay.
Okay, so this myth is related to learner-centered versus learning-centered. Again, something that's very pertinent to this conference and the conversations that we've been having here. The idea where you optimize your platform, your learning design strategies for improving learner satisfaction, just making sure that a happy learner means more learning. That's not necessarily the case. And this is one example where you can see Dunning-Kruger effect in play. So learners don't know what they need. They don't know what their blind spots are. And it's also about metacognition, so knowledge about your own knowledge. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you need. And so that's why, as educators, it's important to balance both. So while making your products and your learning, your courses learner-centered is important, it's critical to emphasize the needs of learning and how we can facilitate that. And so a lot of things that we're doing both in an in-person setting as well as in online platforms, we're doing surveys, we're doing questionnaires, we're doing the thumbs up and the thumbs down throughout the platform, and we're using that as a proxy to measure if our content that we've produced is learning-centered. And again, those things are very useful and they have their place. It's just not how you would necessarily improve and optimize the transfer of learning, which requires a different set of strategies. And so for those sort of things, you need holistic assessment approaches to basically evaluate their knowledge and the transfer of learning, how they're able to replicate that, how they're able to apply that, and all of those things.
Okay, firstly, I just want to recognize this one's on us. I think Doug's been giving us some warnings about times. I think we did take a little bit longer than we had originally planned. So we're just going to quickly go through them, only 2 more slides. I also wanted to mention, related to learning-centered versus learner-centered, there's a really important framework. Is anyone familiar with Kirkpatrick's model or Phillips' model and those models that we use for training evaluation? One thing I wanted to suggest and recommend and encourage everybody is to think about really whether Kirkpatrick's model is the best model for us to evaluate, whether we're talking about reaction or behavior and all those. I think there are, I don't want to use the adjective better, but there are more suitable frameworks out there that actually do allow us to move a little bit further away from being learner-centered and a little bit more towards learning-centered, because the first two, reaction, is entirely about that. So essentially, nothing wrong with measuring learner satisfaction and engagement and interaction. Those are all great things, just not the best proxies for learning. Okay, some of the notable works. If anybody's interested in more, there's a lot of people working out there. I'm part of many research groups. Nothing against gamification, nothing against those techniques. I am part of a group that is AR, XR, and VR in learning. It's just that they have to be done with caution, right? So there are researchers like Daniel Willingham, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. If anybody wants to look at his research, cognitive psychology, amazing work, dispelling a lot of these myths. Carl Hendrick, Paul Kushner, who wrote the book How Learning Happens, seminal works in educational psychology and what they mean in practice. Amazing resource if you want to think about the theoretical underpinnings and how they translate to practice, because a lot of what we talked about, the research is there. It's good. People don't necessarily know how to take that and apply that to their practice. So that's kind of like the bridge between the theory and practice if anybody's interested. Dr. Barbara Oakley, the author of the popular MOOC, Learning How to Learn, is a great resource if you want to get a little bit more into the cognitive neuroscience bit of how learning happens. Will Talhar, and then also Clark Quinn, who takes a lot of practice-based focus on real issues in L&D, especially as Open edX community. That one would be very relevant to a lot of the work that we do. And then finally, we don't have any takeaways that we want to present to the room about these myths, because I think all of you have a lot of experience and knowledge and expertise in the respective domains, right? So instead, we wanted to flip it over to the room and ask a couple of questions. How might we unlearn and relearn some of the issues that we have identified as problematic? Also, how might we use this knowledge of learning myths and sort of orient our practices, whether it's instructional design, whether we're creating a MOOC on Open edX, whether we are, anything, right, in that setting. What can we do with this information? How do we take this knowledge and actually apply that to the learning? So essentially that how might we, I'd be very curious to hear from, oh, awesome. Okay, and then we'd love to hear more if anybody's interested. So.
So I want to talk about the last myth that you mentioned, the learner-centered versus learning-centered, and I agree with what you said, but my interpretation of that initially would have been maybe teacher-centered versus learner-centered, where the teacher would just chalk and talk and there's no engagement. So, for example, the fact that you included Letabo on that slide, I mean, you know, you're trying to consider, okay, we're in South Africa, let's use a local name. So just in the sense of that, connecting maybe considering them. Yeah.
No, that's an amazing point. And one of the things I'll say is the dichotomy of instructor-centered versus learner-centered. I think we've made a lot of progress in coming. We've come a long way. People, at least the people that I talk to, we recognize the importance of being more on the learner-centered. So back in the day, we only used to talk about learning objectives, right? The term learning outcomes or intended learning outcomes, what's the difference between the two? What's the difference between instructional objectives and learning outcomes? A lot of that work, now you see the term learning outcomes when you go to the courses. So I feel like that's a win for us. And you're raising a really good point. It's just that we believe that there is a lot of advancement already done in the instructor versus learner center, so we didn't include it in the 7 because we had a limit. But that is essentially very, very important. So thank you.
There's also an
for sharing.
aversion to now instructional design. People want to say learning design instead of instructional design. So
yeah, and just the cause of that aversion is essentially what you're saying, right? So less of the focus on the instructor and who's going to be doing it and more on who's going to be receiving it, right? That's also aligned with user-centric and the community. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for this great presentation. I have a question in here about your perspective on competence-based learning. And I give the floor to you because I have my opinion, but I'm not.
Ooh, that's going to be hard. Okay, so competency-based learning. So again, I think is a larger topic. And if you want to add anything, Bilal, please feel free to chime in. I think there is a place for it. Yeah.
The assessment of competence-based learning.
Right. So by assessment, you mean like how do we evaluate and assess the learning that happens, or do you mean assessment of the approach? Yes. So I personally think that it's a very multifaceted issue because, when we do instructional design, and apologies to any instructional designers in the room who don't believe in task analysis, I am a big believer of doing a job task analysis and task analysis depending on the context, right? And that ties very well with the competency-based learning, right? So essentially, I'm less interested in how that competency is being demonstrated at the immediate assessment level, but I'm more interested in how we can empower and equip people to actually take that knowledge, also going back to the near versus far transfer of learning. So if I want somebody to recognize danger, right, on the street, right? Let's say I'm creating a course on, I don't know, or maybe workplace health and safety, I think is a better example, right? If I want them to recognize what ergonomic hazards are, and if I want them to recognize what biological hazards in the workplace are, and so on and so forth, I can teach them about this competency of, do you know what I mean? Like I can teach that, but at the end of the day, there's no way for me to know how they're going to demonstrate the acquisition of that competency, right? So the focus needs to be on the far transfer of learning. Like, are they able to recognize those in this context? Maybe yes, but that doesn't mean they're competent. I will only believe and I will only, I don't know how to say this, but I think the acquisition of competence can only be demonstrated in context. And the farther you are from the immediate context, the more reliable that demonstration becomes. So if somebody is able to perform and show the same level of acquisition in contexts that are very unfamiliar to them, that's when I believe that competency has been achieved. That's why I think competency-based learning just has its place, but there's a lot that we need to do about how do you assess learning? What does it mean for someone to actually be competent in an area? We need to define those terms first so that we're on the same page about okay, this is what competence looks like. As long as you're able to show me this, I will believe that, because then it leads to other questions about accreditation and credentialing. How do you provide a credential in Open edX or any other, like demonstration of skills? I don't know. Yes, you've taken the course. Yes, you've demonstrated that competence or capability in that limited context, but I don't know if the credential holds any value beyond that context. So that's my opinion, but I'm happy to chat more. Thank you. Any other questions or ideas on how might we... I don't know if there is another talk in this room, Doug, do you know, or? No, it's a break. Okay, it's a break. Well, I don't, okay, well, I apologize. We're in amazing Stellenbosch out there. I don't know about you, but I'm in love with the city, and I'm in love with the food that we have at the conference. I don't want to be the one between you and the food, but I am happy to stay here. Bilal, I think, would also be happy to stay here if anybody wants to stay and ask any questions.